I hope you all will welcome warmly because we all need warmth right now. And unity with nature really, yeah, it was way opening to have Leslie come and talk today. And we did not know we were gonna get another snow again before we invited Leslie. And Tony and I were talking last night saying we are so ready to hear this right now. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Leslie Ries, who, and I asked how I should introduce her. She said, I'm Tony's wife.
My claim to fame.
And also Leo's mom.
And also Leo's mom, that's right. Those are my credentials. All right, it's hard for me to believe I really need this thing because I'm pretty loud, but I always do what I'm told, as Tony will attest. So, all right, well, if you want to, maybe you can go to the next slide. But yeah, I'm going to talk about monarch butterflies today, which is one of the main species I study. But first I wanted to start by talking a little bit about insects. I know that your group here is probably very aware of the fact that there's a general decline with insects globally. And they call it the insect apocalypse or Insectageddon. They have all sorts of names, but I want to just say why before I get started on monarchs, say why I think it's important. And I also think the monarch, which is definitely the best studied insect in the world. Sometimes I say the best studied non-pest insect, but I've convinced myself that it's actually the best studied insect. So we can learn a lot about insect declines from looking at monarch declines. So first of all, why are insects important? They are by far the most biodiverse group and have the largest terrestrial annual biomass. So like, here's an estimate of all different species richness. These are animals. There are a lot more animals described than other. Then these are hexapods, which are a type of arthropod to which insects belong. And as you go from the bottom to the top, you can just sort of draw this mental lineup. And that means that Coleoptera is about 25% of all described species. Those are beetles. Lepidoptera, which includes butterflies and moths, about 10%. So just in terms of the number of species, by far, insects are the most diverse. But in some ways, even more importantly, they're also the largest in terms of terrestrial biomass. So this is showing the terrestrial biomass of termites, ants, and then all other terrestrial arthropods. And they outweigh all humans, livestock, and wildlife, terrestrial vertebrates combined. So they're essential for our ecosystem services, for nutrient cycling. Like, our ecosystems can't really function without insects. And a lot of times when we think about biodiversity decline, sort of traditionally it's been, declines of individual species. And a lot of times those individual species are highly associated with very, very sensitive habitats. And so, as tragic as it is to lose a species, a lot of times the ecosystem consequences of that are pretty low. But that's one thing that's really different about this global decline of insects, is that it's biomass and the number of species. And so we really are losing them as part of just our terrestrial ecosystems. This is just showing a figure from a recent paper that came out showing that the decline in abundance of all butterflies in the US. And what it basically shows is, even though there's a lot of bouncing around, You know, insects have very, very, very highly variable populations. So they have good years and they have bad years. And the good years and bad years are usually due to weather. You know, but the general decline is usually maybe due to something else. But basically, this is showing for every 5 butterflies that on average you saw in 2000, you would see 4 now. So it is a big decrease. And this analysis came from a huge bringing together of just thousands of surveys that are almost entirely done by citizen scientists. So we really could not even effectively look at these types of declines easily, especially not at the scale that we're able to without, you know, people from the community during these surveys. And I will actually come back to this later. So this is just to show you, like, there's a lot of focus on climate change right now, obviously, and I'll talk about climate change. But in terms of climate change, we often talk about winners and losers, right? Like some species are doing really well and some species do poorly. What this is showing is, like, on the y-axis here, it's the number of species, and this is the change in abundance. This is for the butterflies again. And what you can see here is that just by far the majority of species in the US are declining. So it is a general problem that, you know, we really worry not just for the insects that we love, but for the state of our ecosystems. And another really important factor is what is driving these declines. And this is a really famous figure from one of the main people who studied this, Dave Wagner. And he uses the term death by 1,000 cuts because there's so many different things going on. And I'm not gonna, like, go through these different factors. I mean, you can read some of the headings and they're not gonna be surprising, but it's not just these different factors, it's that they all interact with each other. They all may influence different species differently. So this is kind of like a general sort of dynamic that you can think about, like, for anything that's declining, you know, these could be all the different factors. And the other thing that I'm gonna really focus on with the monarchs is that these also can happen at different periods in time. So for instance, you know, we can have periods of deforestation, but then it stops because for whatever reason, you know, cutting down trees isn't economic anymore. So, you know, you have this period of deforestation that can cause a lot of declines, but then that stops, maybe the forest even comes back. You know, so not only are there lots and lots of different factors, but the most important factors change through time. So that's another thing that makes it really hard to tease apart. And, you know, I get the question all the time, like, why are monarchs declining? And I'm going to talk about that today for the rest of the talk. But it's complicated, you know. All right, next slide. So I'm not going to talk that much about the Endangered Species Act because it's not my area of expertise. But the reality is that the monarchs have already been determined to be worthy of listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And they're currently under petition to actually be listed. And so the main thing that I'm going to talk about today is what is causing the monarch's decline, as best we can tell, and then also what I think we all can do about it. But I am also going to touch on this issue of should they be listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. I'll do that at the end, so if I run out of time, then we can chit chat about it later. So I'm just going to briefly go through the migration of the monarch. Actually, can you go back to the last slide for a second? Because there's something I forgot to point out. So first of all, when we talk about the monarch, especially in the US, we think of the migratory monarch, right? But there are monarchs in lots of other places in the world, and only in this North American population that's separated between the East Coast and the West Coast are they migratory in the way we think about them, round trip migration. And a lot of these areas over here have actually been colonized, maybe in the last 200 years by monarchs, but for sure these populations down here in Central and South America are native, but not migratory. And the other thing I want to point out, so the ones I'm going to talk about are the ones in the east, so they overwinter in Mexico, the ones on the west overwinter in California. And this is by far the biggest population of monarchs. So it is one of the most common insects, or certainly butterflies, in North America. Like, it is an incredibly common species. And you can see here at some of its overwinter grounds, just the orange in this trees is just, they're draped with monarchs, right? So there are millions and millions and millions of monarchs. So it does make it kind of an interesting case study about something that's threatened, because usually those have very small population sizes. So again, I'm going to be talking about this eastern population, and a lot of the research that I'm going to share with you. So first of all, people have been studying monarchs for a long time. I work with citizen scientists. It's one of the main things I do, and I help them manage and share their data. And so through those efforts, my focus has been on using those data in, the main part of the US, whereas before that, we mostly had data on them from the winter in terms of their populations. And I tend to focus on the Midwest. So most of the information that I'm going to be presenting comes from the Midwest. But the Midwest, where the Corn Belt is, that's where their biggest populations are. And that's where the majority of monarchs that make it down to the winter locations emerge from every year. So what happens is, I'm going to start with the end of the summer. So at the end of the summer, the monarchs have been up in the northern part of that region. There are always monarchs in the south, but not as many, although there is also a non-migratory population in Florida, but most of them are up north during the summer. And during the summer, they have 2 to 3 generations, so their populations can grow quite substantially. And at the end of the summer, right, usually mid-August, they're going to start flying south, mid-August to mid-September. So if you can hit the next. So they're beginning this fall migration. This is the most spectacular time, where you can see, like, depending on where you are, dozens or hundreds. They roost in trees the same way they do down in Mexico. So not to the same extent, but you can see these kind of incredible sights. Then when they get down to Mexico, they stay in just a very, very small number of mountaintop overwintering sites. And those sites are all quite close to each other, like very, very close. So all of the monarchs that are spread all over the eastern US sort of converge into this one very small area down in Mexico. So, and here you can see again one of the overwintering just photos of the way they roost in these trees, and they just drape these trees. It's an incredible sight. And then at around the middle of February, so about now, at some point they will start traveling north. So and what they'll do is they'll fly up to the southern US, and they'll spread out, but the vast majority of the ones that go up to the south will stop and lay eggs in eastern Texas and Oklahoma. So even though they're spread out, and that the green is like where they are seen breeding in the spring, almost all of them are right here. And they'll actually stop, lay eggs, those adults die, So it's the next generation, the first of the years, that will then continue up to the summer breeding grounds and produce those 2 to 3 generations. And then the whole thing begins again. So a couple of things that's different about migration, we tend to think about more like bird migration, is first of all, as for most insects, it takes place over several generations. The other thing that we've been learning a lot recently is that even though for a long time we didn't really understand insect migrations, it took a really long time to figure out what was going on with the monarchs, which is a great story by itself. But it turns out that as we continue to gather more evidence, insect migrations, yearly insect migrations are like have more species and are more massive than all the vertebrate aerial migrations put together. So migrating insects are very important, even though most insects do not migrate. Okay, yes. You go to the next one. So I just want to stop and say that a lot of the research that I'm going to be presenting is just a huge collaboration. Like the data we work with comes from all parts of their range, many, many different data sets. And it just takes a huge effort by so many different people. And most of these people are ecological statisticians. So just the amount of effort it takes to really model these data in a reasonable way, it is just a lot of work. So I wanna, this is just a small, these are my main collaborators when it comes to doing monarch work, and there are many other people that I work with. So the first thing I want to point out is, everything in the monarch world tends to be really controversial until it's not. The monarchs were our best data starts in 1993, and you can see that progression. And the first paper that was really published, really saying there's a decline, was back in 2012. And you can see that that decline looks really real, but people argued about it for a long time. As we continue to collect data, it's very, very clear that monarchs are declining, or at least the overwinter colony sizes are declining. This is totally based on the overwinter colony sizes. And they've even sort of taken this data and moved backwards, even though these data are very fragmentary. And again, it's this group of ecological statisticians that I talked about who reconstructed this data. So going back to 1976, when the overwinter colony were first found by Western scientists, not by Western scientists, though, it was a citizen science couple in Mexico who found them. You can just see this really rapid decline. So I'm going to talk a lot about what is causing this decline. So first, I've already mentioned that this changes over time. So when we first discovered, or the monarchs were first discovered, that entire wooded area, forested region of Mexico, like many regions in the world and in the United States, was undergoing forest deforestation. So the first thing we know about monarchs is forest loss in Mexico was almost certainly a big driver of these losses. Now, we don't know what happened before 1976. We have no data on that. I mean, I don't want to say no data, but almost no data. And I'll explain in a little while why that sort of stops at 2008. But we don't have a ton of data about what this forest loss looked like and how maybe on a year-to-year basis it might have driven these declines, but we're reasonably certain that it was a major factor. And of course, when they discovered these overwinter colonies, it was such
sort of an amazing site that very quickly these overwinter sites got afforded protection. So a reserve was established in 1980. Kind of hard to enforce ending logging, but still it was a first step. And then it was actually declared a UNESCO site in 2008. And at that time, it really bolstered the amount of protection. And even though that protection is controversial amongst the people who live there, it has been a partnership. Like, I'm not going to go into that either, and it's not even my area of expertise at all. But it's an interesting story just to hear about, the protection of these mountains. So then what people have heard a lot about and what made it into the news was in the mid-90s, there was this release and main adoption of Roundup Ready crops. Now, Roundup, for people who use herbicides in their garden, you know that if you go to Home Depot and you get an herbicide like Roundup is one of the main ones that you might get. And they also used it extensively in agriculture. But you can't just spray herbicides on crops, because crops are plants. So the ability to use herbicides has always been restricted. But then through technologies, they created these crops that were resistant to Roundup. And when that happened, they started spraying, very, very broadly. And the reality is that a lot of monarch habitat has always been associated with agriculture because their favorite host plant is the common milkweed. Like, there are about 150 species of milkweed. In the US, maybe 90 to 100. They are known to use most of those, but without a doubt, their favorite milkweed is common milkweed. It's the one they do the best on. And so, since common milkweed were actually, concentrated around these agricultural areas, all of a sudden this place where was a major place where they were recruited, was undergoing milkweed decline. And of course, this was during a time of monarch declines as well, and it became quite controversial about whether or not Roundup was causing monarch declines. And I'll come back to that later. So that, by the time you got to the early 2000s, that had kind of leveled off. So that doesn't mean that it's still not important. It's just that, for continued declines, you wouldn't necessarily tie it to Roundup, right? Roundup maybe caused the overall population to decline over a 10-year period, and then maybe it's anchored down at that new place, and it could stay steady there, but then other factors come into account. So then we have the release and adoption of neonicotinoids, which is a type of pesticide, or specifically an insecticide. And neonicotinoids have been around for a long time, but these were seed-coated neonicotinoids. So you plant the seeds, they have these seed coatings on, and again, I'm not an expert, but I think part of the idea was like, you're not spraying it, like it's going to be a little bit more safe for non-target insects. But the reality is that not only does it take it up into the tissue of these plants, but it also just leaches out into the environment. So there was a lot of concern that neonicotinoids were causing further declines, not just of monarchs, but of butterflies, bees. A ton of research has been done on bees. And then the final thing that's really been happening, of course, is we're in a time of climate change. And the thing that's really important about climate change is that we know it's been going on actually for a long time. Like they see this signature of it all the way back to the 1930s. But it's only in the 2000s where the actual changes in temperature have been like really substantial year over year. And I'm sure people have heard that like, oh, you know, the hottest 10 years have all been in the last 10 years, you know, so we hear that over and over again. So climate change is not only like becoming probably a bigger influence in the 1990s, but it's accelerating. So there's just one more thing. So these are the main causes that I'm going to talk about, the main threats. And I also just want to point out again about the monitoring data we use. So regular types of citizen science monitoring began actually in the 1970s. And then they began doing regular monitoring in 1993 in the winter. They would measure the size of these colonies. And then that expanded in 2003. And then finally, summer monitoring expanded. And when citizen science suddenly became like a huge thing that people heard about, it kind of took off. And so the important thing isn't just that like, oh, we have all this monitoring and the monitoring helps us answer these questions, but the amount of data increases substantially over time, which means that it's easier to figure out what's going on in that period of monitoring expansion, which coincides with the period of climate expansion, right? So there's already like this bias towards thinking like it's going to be easiest to show that climate is associated with declines and maybe harder during other periods because we don't have as much data. This is a big challenge, and this is why there are so many statisticians who work on that, but I just wanted to point that out. They're still logging. And so, you know, you remember that it was declared as a UNESCO site in 2008. And during the period around that, you can still see a lot of forest loss, and it really falls off after 2008. And then it falls off even more. So illegal logging is the black of these bars, but the rest is climate related. So the climate is causing the decline of the forest that they are specialized for in Mexico. And this also shows another difficult thing about trying to figure out what factors are influencing the decline of any species, because they're both direct and indirect effects, right? So the climate directly affects the monarchs, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it also indirectly affects them by the loss of their forests, which is being lost due to climate. And that's, again, currently the main way that forest is lost. So what I'm going to be showing you moving forward is a comprehensive analysis that really focused on their entire cycle. And this was one of the first analysis that really did the entire cycle. And so we have from the time they're in the overwintering grounds to this main breeding area in the spring, and then the summer breeding area in the north central part of their breeding area. And then as they're coming back, this area like is going to potentially be important for them, because as they're migrating back to Mexico, they need, you know, energy in the form of nectar, and so that could become a factor as well. And so we pulled these data together from as many sources as possible. We had 18,000 individual surveys between 1993 and 2018. And I just want to say, in these zones right here, we have tons and tons of survey data. These are volunteers going out and they set up a transect and they go back to it over and over and over and do what is basically an academic like survey. Here we have almost no data, like almost none. And then here we have a lot of what we call opportunistic data. So opportunistic data is if you're walking along and you see a monarch, there are a lot of places that you can report that monarch to. which is really useful, incredibly useful data, but it's not as useful as survey data. So already, we're gonna try to parse apart the different stages at which their population changes seem to be the most important. But again, just in different regions, we have different amounts of data. And so one of the things that I always try to emphasize is like, it's really hard to answer these questions for all of the reasons I've mentioned. Like, it changes over time. There are lots of different factors. The factors interact with each other. We have different amounts of data. We have more data, again, on monarch than any other species of insect. But still, there are places where we have huge gaps in these data. And I want to kind of remind you before we go on to the next couple of slides that we have almost no data here. And what I'm gonna, like, this is a little spoiler alert, but the spring in Texas is the most important factor that influences the size of their population from year to year. So the time that we know the absolute least is the time that seems to be the most important to them. The time where we maybe know the absolute most, we're like thousands and thousands and thousands of people are tagging them and monitoring them and reporting them. Like, the fall migration doesn't seem at this time to be something that's particularly important in their decline. So this is just showing you where all our surveys are, hardworking people. So these are the results down here. Oh, these kind of shifted around. And so what we're doing here is we're partitioning these different potential causes into how important they are for the year-to-year population size. So if it's a good year or a bad year. And we're also going to be able to use that to tell how they're associated with the decline. So I want to start over here for what predicts this population in the South. And it is almost entirely the population at the end of the summer. So how big the population is really influenced by how big it was there, which you think like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But it's important to realize that if they're losing some more forested area, that doesn't have a big impact. Of course, they're not losing very much now. And autumn nectar and just the state of habitat along the flyway south seems to have basically no impact at all on the populations. And that's important to know because for quite a while there was this debate about whether the loss in monarchs, the decline in monarchs was caused by something going on in their breeding grounds or loss during the migration. So at this point, we don't think it's lost during migration. And then this is the last from 2003 to 2018. And what you can see is that spring weather accounts for about 60% of the variability, summer weather about 30%, summer crops and herbicide a very small amount, and the winter population size a really tiny amount. So again, now the size that it starts here and ends up here, it's almost all the size of the population, but going the other way, it's almost not at all. So you can have a ton of butterflies down in the winter and still have a really bad showing in the summer. And that's because it all depends on their populations being able to grow over 4 generations, right? And the most important one is spring, like how much they can grow in that first generation of the year seems to really set how big their populations can get. And for the period before this, which I'm not showing you the results from, that's like the 15 years before this, this was more like 80%. So summer weather, the importance of summer weather has been growing. And that's almost surely due to climate change as it gets hotter and hotter and hotter in the north central region. But again, notice how little crops and herbicides, so that's glyphosate, impacted. And this was really controversial because people think of glyphosate, like the loss of milkweed and spraying milkweed as being a major cause. Now, this study did not include neonicotinoids at all. And so you can't really say how neonicotinoids impacted them, but if you can go to the next slide, what this is showing, and I'm not going to go into detail here, but these are the different pesticides used, and this is looking at the effect size of all these different factors. So glyphosate is like Roundup, not Roundup herbicides, and then all these others are insecticides. These two hadn't been around for a really long time and being super, super toxic, but still neonicotinoids, like the more spraying or the more use of these seed-coated neonicotinoids, the biggest decline. So I'm going to talk about that for just a little bit longer. So go to the next. So again, you can't do anything without collaborators. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the herbicides and the pesticides and insecticides in the Midwest. And this was a really big study because the reason that that study that I was talking about didn't include neonicotinoids is we couldn't get data on neonicotinoids like that from the industry, right? So, so these are agricultural economists, these three guys, and Nick Haddad is one of my longtime collaborators. And so because we were working with them, we had access to these data. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but this top row is overall species richness of butterflies, overall abundance of butterflies, and abundance of monarchs. And what this is showing is it's what's called a counterfactual analysis. It's based on a big statistical model that sort of imagines like what would have happened if the types of pesticides we used in 1998, the beginning of the study, had just stayed the same throughout. And then it would look at all the other factors. And when you see a change, it actually means that you're controlling for all the other factors. And the fact that you see this decline here means something different happened with the insecticides. And what you can see is like herbicides don't seem to have a big overall impact. Insecticides, not surprisingly, things that kill insects are having a much bigger impact. And that's true for richness, abundance, and even more so the abundance of monarchs. And this decline starts at 2003. That's when neonicotinoids were released. So neonicotinoids, even though I'm about to start telling you how it's all about climate, we don't really know how neonicotinoids are associated with the overall decline, and we also don't know how they interact with climate. So this is just what I was saying earlier, like summer is getting more and more important, and we think that is because it's just getting hotter and hotter and hotter in the summer. So something that, you know, wasn't a problem back in the early 2000s and 1990s is suddenly becoming a big problem. But overall, if you go by this one sort of unified, try to include everything as much as possible in one analysis, the results are that summer remains less important in spring, but its importance has grown over time. But the evidence suggests that climate is the primary driver of declines since the mid-1990s. But we did not consider the role of neonicotinoids. So I want to come back to glyphosate because there's been a huge amount of focus on this. Again, this is the Roundup. I just noticed you can order it from DoorDash. I didn't know. I like that was like, I know you can get anything from DoorDash. And here they are spraying it on the crops. Milkweed is just tons of milkweed in roadsides, especially in highly agricultural areas. Monarch habitat, like roadside habitat, is one of monarch's favorite habitats. So there's tons of milkweed in the roadsides, monarchs in the roadsides. And of course, when you're spraying this, you think like, okay, well, that's going to be killing the milkweed, but there's still so much milkweed left in the landscape. Like it's milkweed. It was, you know, classified as a noxious weed for decades, which meant farmers were like actively trying to kill it, and it was still everywhere, right? Like, it's a weed. And again, we don't see a big impact of it, so it became a huge area of controversy. Like, does the use of glyphosates actually cause declines? And here again, the neonicotinoids came out really big, but not the glyphosates. So before I say a little bit about why I do think they're important, I also want to just mention that they have been associated with human cancer rates for a long time. I'm not the kind of person who studies this, so I'm just going by this Washington Post study, but they just found like a particular rise in the Corn Belt. That's where it's used the most. So other reasons. So here's our best evidence, I think, that glyphosate is important for loss of monarchs. And what this is showing is that from a time, remember I was saying there's this adoption, when it first comes out, people don't use it that much. So this is application right at the start, and then it sort of levels off. So when it was first being adopted is when you saw this decline, and you saw a bigger decline in the crop areas versus the non-crop areas. And I think this shows that this is important, but it probably is just a small portion of what is causing the decline. But then it sort of gets at a question of like, well, if the monarchs obviously need this, they're flying north, and a big part of their region, there isn't as much milkweed there. So how easily can monarchs find the next patch of milkweed? So this is kind of where I'm going to end, because talking about milkweed and planting milkweed, which is a huge kind of effort right now, is the thing that we can do the most, right? Like, yes, if we could pass a law that bans neonicotinoids, but there's only so much that each person in this room can do about that. But we all, have maybe some efforts that we can make, but then the question is, like, how much good does that do for monarchs? And that's what I'm going to talk about. So first of all, monarchs need to move huge distances. And, when habitat is broken up, you can drive them up there, but we can't do that with monarchs. You can have these corridors, or you can have these stepping stones that kind of let them move. And this is a big thing that we talk about in conservation biology. And so the idea that residential gardens can be effective stepping stones for monarchs and for other insects, because these gardens can not only have a huge impact, but they also have like a social contagion effect. And I'm going to talk about that for a little bit, because now there's a really big movement to certify gardens. So you can get your garden certified as wildlife, you can get your garden certified as pollinator habitat. That can mean planting flowers, as you see here, but it can also mean leaving the leaves. Like, don't rake up all your leaves, because leaves are where a lot of insects spend the winter, obviously not monarchs. What this is showing is that when someone plants a pollinator garden in their yard, the chances of their neighbors also having a pollinator garden increases substantially. And once you get about 30 neighbors away, it goes away. And this isn't even accounting for the signs. So not only can planting your own garden potentially make a big difference, but it can also make a difference by like having that contagion in your neighborhood. So, but gardens can also be negative. We were talking about this earlier, monarchs would normally not encounter milkweed on the flight south, but now they are more and more because people plant their gardens. And what this is showing is that, exotic milkweed is much more common in the fall, and where they lay, this is where the monarchs lay eggs, is much more common on exotic milkweed. So they're laying eggs on exotic milkweed they shouldn't be laying eggs. Those eggs probably won't develop into an adult and they won't fly down. And then there's also an issue of disease. So this is just showing, especially in people's yards, especially when you have a small yard and it's the only yard around, that there's going to be a higher incidence of disease. Although we don't know that that has any impact on their population. But because of these things, there is now a huge effort. First of all, I was saying lots of different places certify gardens. So Monarch Watch is one of the biggest ones, and they have 10,000 certified gardens in the country. So that's kind of amazing. And because the main corridor is through Texas up through the Midwest, there's a big effort right now to focus on Highway I-35 and just plant that with milkweed and other helpful plants. And so, it's really hard to say how these patches of milkweed, especially the smaller ones, as opposed to maybe one continuous route, is going to help monarchs, because we don't really know how much milkweed still impacts monarchs. We know there's an association. It doesn't seem to explain a lot of the variability. But it's also a really, really hard thing to study, because we know it probably isn't a loss of habitat in the sense that there's not enough milkweed out there for them. There certainly is. And so there's a big focus on like how easy it is for them to find the next patch of milkweed. And so right now we have this new transformative technology. We've been putting sticker tags on monarchs since the 1950s. Well, they finally made radio tags. You can barely see it there, small enough to put on monarchs. And so this monarch is tagged up near Kansas City. It's Monarch MW026, although you can certainly name your monarchs. And there are towers all the way down, but there are also cell towers, and they can ping off of cell towers. And so you can see this one monarch followed all the way down to the Mexican overwinter grounds, released on September 7th, got down there on November 9th. This is part of where it was released. And so you not only get this really big, large scale movement, but you can also get this really granular movement. This just got released last year. So this past summer was the first summer these tags were used. Lots of people tagged them. You can download an app called Project Monarch, and then you can follow them. These tags cost $200, so they're not quite at the point where people are probably going to want to buy them themselves. But people name their monarchs, as you see there, and you can track these monarchs. And this is showing about 400 tracks from Project Monarch. And for me, as a scientist, like the potential to use these data to finally be able to answer this question that we've been arguing about for so long, like, why does the loss of milkweed in the landscape seem to have an impact on the monarchs? One of the main hypotheses is to figure out how it impacts them moving through the landscape. And now we're going to have that ability. So that's really exciting for me. And it can answer other questions. So I had said that Florida, the population there is non-migratory, but we don't really know that. Like, people say that all the time. We know at least a lot of them are non-migratory. They're there all year, but we're getting more and more evidence that they are also moving back and forth with that North American migration. So, the ability, and you can see that here too, so just, again, the best studied insect is now going to be even better studied, because there aren't that many insects you're going to be able to put these tags on. So we're really excited about that. So what else can you guys do other than planting gardens? One is join a monitoring project. Remember, these are all monitoring routes. There are thousands and thousands of them, and every single route is helpful. There are opportunities for projects that focus just on the monarch. So here you track caterpillars and even can look at things like disease on the caterpillars. There's a project called Journey North where you report the first monarch you see every season, which is particularly helpful. And there's also a project like iNaturalist, which people here may be familiar with. You can report any sort of biological thing on iNaturalist, and tons of people do. Like, this data is just hugely helpful. And you may notice this is just a snapshot of the area right around this building. And so, even if you're like, what butterflies are around here? One of the best things to do is to go onto iNaturalist, and it'll tell you. So I kind of want to end where I started, which is this idea of, are monarchs threatened, and should they be listed? So it's really hard for me to imagine that monarchs are going to go extinct anytime soon. Like, there are just so many of them, and they're super abundant. But we know that super abundant species can go extinct. So this is the famous passenger pigeon that used to be like the most common, most abundant bird on Earth. They said that every third bird in the US was a passenger pigeon. That was in 1860. In 1902, the last wild one had been killed. So the ability to have a super common species go extinct, we know that happens. Now, people were killing them, so that's a little different. But in terms of the monarch, it's really hard to say that they're in danger of going extinct, but there are still good reasons to list them. We know that they've been declining, and we know that, things are unheard of until they're not, right? So the way I think about it more is like, is it a good idea? Like, once something gets listed by the federal government, it gets really hard to bring them into your backyard and rear them with your kids. Like, the impact of that to me is huge. It also gets harder to study them, like to set up things like the MLMP project. Like, we don't know what kind of permitting people would need. To me, like, I personally see a lot more downsides to listing, if only through what might be a loss of engagement. The other thing is, it's polarizing. When species are listed by the Endangered Species Act, it also has a huge political fallout. And I'll just say, like, from experience, monarchs are just universally loved. People love monarchs. People care about monarchs. I worry that if we list them, a huge portion of the country will stop caring about monarchs, especially if they find their own activities being curtailed by the federal government. I mean, these things are everywhere, including in your own gardens. There are no polar bears in your gardens, so it's not something we usually have to think about.
Thanks for watching our video. For more content from Sandy Spring Friends Meeting, click to subscribe.